work with the people that I worked with, especially Stan and Sarita, who've done so much for the city of Jamestown in so many ways. And then Jamestown is particularly blessed with the artisans that we have from the old furniture industry, and with the Farrells and the people that do so much. And everyone contributed on time to get this room done. This whole building is a jewel for the community, and to have the Robert H. Jackson Center, so now there's a repository for everything that he had and stood for. And I think it's great for Jamestown, and I just appreciate having a hand in doing this room. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just give you one quick Barclay story. You can see the beautiful tones that are in here in terms of color. And last Thursday night, before he left for Florida, the next day, Barclay went up to Buffalo to a Oriental rug shop and spent an hour pawing through their rugs and came up with this beautiful Oriental you see here, which pulls it all together. Really, if you look at the colors in the room, it's sort of the final capstone in terms of the color situation. So we want to thank Barclay again. Well, now we get down to the main event, Stanley and Sarita Weeks. I talked to Stanley before Christmas about getting involved in paying for this room, and I said, Stanley, we don't have a real programmatic purpose for this room except for speakers who come and for television and radio interviews and things like that. But I said, we'd like to make a room and leave a room here in this building that will let people know what an elegant 1860s drawing room, formal parlor looked like. And would you like to get involved? And he finally signed up. And then he went off to Florida, and we spent his money. And you see it here today. And I asked Stanley, by the way, who was mayor of this town in 1952 and 53, I believe, among all the other things he's done, and a member probably here at the consistory for 60 years or something, and also visited Robert Jackson in 1935 down in Washington when Jackson was Assistant General Counsel to the Department of the Internal Revenue. And so he's got Jackson connections. And I've asked Stanley to say a few words, and then I'd like to introduce Sarita after you're done with your remarks, Stanley.
Thank you very much, Raleigh. This building, the whole complex here, has been part of my life for some years, and I was delighted when Bill Cass called us in South Africa to say that it looks as though there's a contract for the sale of it to the people that were interested in the Jackson Center, which was not yet developed too far, but it was very exciting to hear from Bill, and we thank you again, Bill, for that telephone call to South Africa. But the whole building here has had a very proud history, and I'm much impressed by that. Alonzo Kent, 144 years ago, built the place, and I think it's one of the oldest and most remarkable buildings in the whole city of Jamestown. I remember when I was young, there were many homes of quite prominent, and this one survived the demolition process, which usually goes in a city as they grow older. And then I was associated, as Roland mentioned, with Freemasonry. The Freemasons purchased the property almost 80 years ago, and they were very good stewards, and they were dedicated to a worthy influence of ethics and morality. So they did not besmirch the building at all. They extended the auditorium and the dining room and a very accommodating kitchen, which is still here and now part of the Jackson Center. But the whole complex, and I want to thank very much the artisans and persons who took part in the reconstruction of this room to its beautiful original condition. The Alonzo Kent, you can see in the gold leaf moldings there, the letter K, which was Kent. Alonzo Kent was also a member of the Masonic Lodge in Jamestown years ago. And it was Greg Peterson who enlisted, as he has already mentioned, Carl Kappa and Betty Linnae and the Gebbe Foundation. It's amazing what Greg has been able to do to put together the Jackson Institute. He has done incomparable research, and his energy and drive to succeed has paid off in many ways. Just last night I listened on the television, the Karamatsu program, which Greg put on, and it was a real document and attributed to the Jackson Center through Greg Peterson. And I commend and thank the many people who took part in renovating this room, and they're renovating, which we'll celebrate next week, Betty Linnae's contribution on the outside. But I think the whole complex here is a very tangible tribute to the memory of one of the nation's greatest jurists and our own friend, Bob Jackson. And thank you all for coming this afternoon to celebrate the dedication of this room. Now we can turn it over to Sarita. She may have...
Speaking of amazing, so is your jacket, and you mentioned that that's the family
tartan, yes.
Explain it. Explain the family tartan. I don't know what that means.
A tartan, of course, that's a cloth that the Scots have in the Highlands. And each clan has its own weave and detail. It's just a terrific thing. They have to have them registered in some sort of an office, but this particular tartan is prescribed for the Ross clan. And of course my mother was a Ross. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in Glasgow before they came to Canada. And they came to Canada, Hamilton, Ontario, and that's where my mother was born, in Hamilton. Then they moved to Rochester, and then eventually to Jamestown.
So your mother's brother was Emmett Ross?
Yes.
Okay.
That was my mother's brother, and when my mother and father passed away, my uncle Emmett Ross and Anna, his wife, took my sister and brother and myself as sort of foster children. And they lived at 1111 Prendergast Avenue, right here.
This would be your mother. Was she born in Scotland?
No, she was born in Hamilton, Ontario.
So it'd be your
My grandfather was in Glasgow. Actually, Govan, G-O-V-A-N, which is, at that time, was a suburb of Glasgow. He was a lawyer, yes.
Where did you go to law school?
Albany.
Albany?
I think it was 1881. Incidentally, he was a charter member of the law fraternity Phi Delta Phi. He was a charter member there in Albany Law. The chapter of the legal fraternity no longer is there. And fortunately, when I went to Cornell Law School, I was able to join Phi Delta Phi as well, which I thought was very nice because that was where my father had joined.
Were you destined to be a lawyer?
No, I was destined to be a doctor. But I went to Colgate University, and at Colgate, unfortunately, my advisor didn't do anything about advising what I should take or what I should do. That was in the early time when advisors for students was in its embryo stage, I guess. So they didn't know what they were doing anyway. So at the end of my first year, it was found that, gosh, what I had taken was not pre-medical, but just a general smear of courses. So I, at that point, decided, well, I guess I'm going to follow my father's footsteps and become a lawyer. And my father, James L. Weeks, was the senior partner in the firm of Weeks and Ross. And Emmett Ross, my uncle, was the junior partner. Way. And that's why I became a lawyer, by accident. I wanted to be a doctor. I don't know why.
So then you went to Cornell.
At Cornell Law School.
Your undergraduate work was where?
You know, it's a complicated history. Sometimes I'm embarrassed, and sometimes I feel a lot of glee. I spent 2.5 years at Colgate, and then I thought I should be in Washington, D.C., because that's where the action was, and that would be good for pre-law. So at the end of 2.5 years, I moved to George Washington University in the District of Columbia, and that was a very wise move, I think, and I look back on it. George Washington, and in those days it was sort of a pedestrian thing. They had streetcars, no buses, and so I walked a great deal. And my classes were in the morning, and in the afternoon I would go to the Capitol buildings for the Supreme Court sessions and both houses of Congress, and some of the commissions were meeting in the afternoon, so it worked out wonderfully. My classes in the morning and going to the government in the afternoon. Incidentally, that's when I went to see Bob Jackson, of course, from Jamestown, and he had been, this was the New Deal period when Roosevelt was holding sway, and Bob Jackson was Commissioner of Internal Revenue. So I and my friend who had come to Washington with me, Alexander Carsilius, Bud Carsilius from Jamestown, both of us went to visit Jackson in his big, luxurious room. It was a huge room, as I recall. And, of course, Jackson was very affable, as he usually was. And it was a very enjoyable interlude. But anyway...
And he would have known you through the relationship with Emmett Ross?
What was that?
He would have known who you were through the relationship
Oh,
with
yes.
Emmett?
Of course, I had known Bob here in Jamestown because our offices, my uncle's, which I spent a lot of time in, was in the Hotel Jamestown, and Bob Jackson and his firm, Jackson, Herrick, Turkin, and Leet, was also located in the Hotel Jamestown. So I used to see him quite often while he was in Jamestown, which was a very pleasant thing because I never saw him upset. He was always a sort of a calm personality, and as you know, a terrific attorney.
So here you are in George Washington, and how long were you there for?
Well, 2 years, and then I graduated from George Washington Law School. That was when the National Cathedral, I don't know whether you've been there or not, but the National Cathedral is just a beautiful structure. But our baccalaureate service in graduation was held in the National Cathedral, which was only constructed as far as the transepts, but the rest of the nave and the superstructure had not been constructed at that time. So that sort of dates me way back. But I graduated in 1939 from law school. 1935, I graduated from undergraduate. So I had four alma maters to contend with, and I didn't realize, but now they're all asking for funds.
They don't forget you.
Instead of just 2, I had 4. But it's well worth it. It was a great experience. As I say, Washington was streetcars, no buses, and we walked. As in those days, we used to walk back and forth to school and our classes, and even to the Capitol, and all the sights of Washington. It was a great place.
So you're there, and this is President Roosevelt's era. This is the era of Charles Evans Hughes as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Yes.
Did you ever go into the Supreme Court to see an argument?
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, those were all available to us because they all met in the afternoon. Now, let's see, it was Charles Evans Hughes. I lived at, for a while, I was several places, but 1717 I Street. That was the last place that I was rooming at. And right across the street was the Supreme Court Justice. It wasn't Charles Evans Hughes. But anyway, a retired Supreme Court Justice lived right across the street from 1717I, and every day his chauffeur with a beautiful, shiny Packard. Packard was a beautiful car in those days. they'd take him for his afternoon ride, which was interesting.
Well, let's see, I think at the time, Oliver Wendell Holmes would have been either on the court or recently retired.
I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Yeah, he's pretty old then.
Yes. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes that lived across the street from us. Now, all that, the buildings that were there, the houses and everything were all destroyed and replaced by government buildings. But I liked the winters in Washington. You got very little snow, but just cold and crisp and blue skies against the white marble buildings. Politics, which was an interesting phase of my life, I guess, because Sid Hughes was the assistant district attorney in Jamestown and a very good friend of ours. He wanted me to run for the school board in Jamestown because he was retiring. He said, "Oh, there'll be a place for you." Well, of course, you have to run for the office. You just can't be placed in an office like that. So I ran and was fortunate to be elected to the school board. And then from the school board, just having returned from the Navy and being young and spunky, I suppose, they wanted me to run for some other office. So you just don't go into those things without going up the ladder. So I then ran for the county supervisor. There were, I think, 6 county supervisors from Jamestown, and I was successful in that, so had a term of office on the county supervisors, which was very interesting. That's when the county home was in DeWittville. Oh, that was a tremendous place. I think around 440 acres of farmland. It was almost self-sufficient. They grew their own vegetables and their beef, cattle, and all that. It was a wonderful experience. And then some politician got under their skin to transfer the county home to Dunkirk. Well, then the old county home at DeWittville went into disrepair. They had barns and all equipment and everything. As I say, almost self-sufficient, which was a wonderful asset for the county, but politics intervened and it was transferred. But anyway, from county supervisor, then Pat Schobeck and Oscar Linné and Russ Rogerson were influential in political circles at that time, and they wanted me to run for mayor. Well, I did, against Sam Stroke, who was the sitting mayor, and I was defeated by 411 votes, I think. So I cooled my heels for another 2 years and then ran again. And see, it was a nonpartisan system of elections. So the second time I ran, I got the endorsement from both the Republican and Democratic parties, which pretty much assured me of success. Well, success came my way, and we were elected. And it was a great experience to be mayor of Jamestown, because my father had been mayor in around 1907 or 19 to 1909, I think. And so...
When was your term?
What was that?
What years were you mayor?
1952 and 53. I didn't run again because I figured if I was going to be a lawyer, I'd have to practice law. If I stayed in the mayor's office, why, all vestige of my legal practice would disappear.
And Moonbrook Country Club specifically. You were kind of there at the beginning, and you and your Uncle Emmett, and tell me a little bit about Stan Weeks, Sarita Weeks, Emmett Ross, and Moonbrook.
Oh, golly. Well, of course, Emmett was dyed-in-the-wool golfer at Moonbrook. He joined when it was in its early infancy, I think, around 1923. And, well, he'd take my brother and me, and sometimes my sister Mary, up to play golf, and he showed us the rudiments of the game, which was very helpful. He was an excellent golfer. He had a good set of Scottish-made golf clubs. I had some of them framed, and they're up in the grill at Moonbrook now, just to show what they were like. Of course, they're wooden shafts and wooden heads, which now are passé, but they did the work. And we got scores, and sometimes you wonder, well, why do we have all these fancy ones? Well, of course, the makers know what there's in it for them. It's expense. But the old clubs were very, very good. But anyway, 1925, my Uncle Emmett Ross thought there should be junior tournaments. Up to that point, it had been just for men. Women were not playing at that point. So he presented a beautiful cup. It's in the trophy case at Moonbrook now, with cross clubs and a ball, and beautifully designed cup for junior golf. And as fortune would have it, I was the first winner of that cup in 1925, and it's been going ever since, and there's the names of all the winners all over the cup, beautifully engraved. Now they've had to have a new standard so that more names can be put on it. And then I was the JHS, Jamestown High School champion. I don't think there's a trophy for that, but anyway, I was the champion of that. And I played fairly well, and was a heavy hitter with the old-fashioned clubs, wooden shafts, and wooden heads for the first three clubs. But then my uncle, Emmett Ross, he was chairman of the Greens Committee when the second 9 holes was constructed. Now, Moonbrook was quite a place. the first 9 holes, which we played for many years before the seconds were devised, extended around a wooded area, a huge acreage of wooded area. And the gullies were rustic and difficult to get in and out of. Now there are these pools of water. They've dammed them up so that the pools are very challenging. And but the old ones, the old days, they used to have golf where you'd carry your clubs or have to have a caddy. You didn't have even pull carts or electric machines like they have now. Of course, real golf is a walking game. And of course, a lot of men can't walk that distance anymore, so they have a cart. More of them should walk and could walk, but a lot of them can't, which is understandable. And Moonbrook had its stages, different layouts at different times. The major holes are still intact. Some of them across the highway now went up to just north of Dr. Sanctuary's home. And then those 2 houses on North Main Street near the city line. That was, one of those was Horace Breyer's house. And that would then go down the hill to where the highway is now, if you can visualize that. But in those days, the country club, which was actually the golf club, it wasn't the country club. It didn't have swimming pool, it didn't have tennis courts, it didn't have any of those other things. So it was the golf course. Now it's the country club. But let's see, what was I going to say? I don't connect here. But
The layout of the club.
yes, well, the layout of the club was considerably different, particularly when the highway was constructed. It cut it in 2. So there have been a number of changes because of that. And Frank Vassallo, whom we met this morning, has been an excellent manager of the club. He takes care of all the interior part of it and has done marvelously to keep it together. And he's been manager of the club longer than any other person before him. Oh, what I was going to mention was that the first clubhouse was an old farmhouse, and you would approach from North Main Street just beyond where the new highway entrance is, and go up, and there was this old farmhouse, and that was the clubhouse. And eventually it's where Howard Holmes and his family, Howard Holmes was one of the professionals, he and his family lived in this old farmhouse. And Wally Holmes now, who owns Maplehurst Country Club, was brought up there and got his first instructions on how to play golf from his father. So hole number 1 started just above there, and that would be now number 3. Number 3 presently was the original number 1. But
when did women become part of the golf scene? I mean, certainly that was a good part of Sarita's life as well. She loved it.
oh, yes. Well, as soon as we came to Johnstown after marriage, she wanted to get in to play golf because she had been on the varsity team at Wellesley College and also played with the varsity members at Yale, although they didn't have women on the Yale team, but they had her come along on a number of them. So she wanted to get right into the game. She was good. She could bat them right out. And she was head of the Ladies Golf Association there, and that was at one time. And she figured that they weren't regulated enough. So she decided the USGA rules of golf, that's the United States Golfing Association rules, should apply to women as well as the men. So she did see that that was brought about so that the women would be playing under the same rules. Since then, I guess they've abandoned the USGA rules for women, but I'm not quite sure as to what extent. But at one time, she was the Moonbrook Women's Champion, and on several occasions she won the Packard Cup, which was donated by Mrs. Packard from Lakewood, and had a number of other wins to her credit. But she was head and heels for that, and it used to be among the men as well as the women